Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Taqabbal Allah amalikum jami'an. We start with reciting the Holy Quran. Inshallah, I will be reciting from Surah Al-Ahqaf, Surah number 46. After Allah, salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajjal farajahum. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم حميم تنزيل الكتاب من الله العزيز الحكيم ما خلقنا السماوات والأرض وما بينهما إلا بالحق وأجل مسمى والذين كفروا عما أنذروا معرضون قل أرأيتم ما تدعون من دون الله أروني ماذا خلقوا من الأرض أم لهم شرك في السماوات ائتوني بكتاب من قبل هذا أو أثارة من علم إن كنتم صادقين ومن أضل ممن يدعو من دون الله من لا يستجيب له إلى يوم القيامة وهم عن دعائهم غافلون وإذا حشر الناس كانوا لهم أعداء وكانوا بعبادتهم كافرين وإذا تتلى عليهم آياتنا بينات قال الذين كفروا للحق لما جاءهم هذا سحر مبين أم يقولون افتراه قل إن افتريته فلا تملكون لي من الله شيئا قل إن افتريته فلا تملكون لي من الله شيئا هو أعلم بما تفيضون فيه كفى به شهيدا بيني وبينكم وهو الغفور الرحيم قل ما كنت بدعا من الرسل وما أدري ما يفعل بي ولا بكم إن أتبع إلا ما يوحى إلي وما أنا إلا نذير مبين قل أرأيتم إن كان من عند الله وكفرتم به وشهد شاهد من بني إسرائيل على مثله فآمن واستكبرتم إن الله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات اللهم صل على محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Thank you very much, brother, for that beautiful Quran recitation. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, dear brothers and sisters. I hope you can hear me. Everyone hear me properly? Okay, I will speak a bit louder. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. My name is Mariam Hanif, and I'll be your host for today. Welcome to another quarantine entertainment session. Today's session is the topic on student social justice activism. Before we begin, I would just like to say thank you very much to ABSA Network for having me host this session. I'm speaking to you from the UK, so it's 3 a.m. here. But in the UK, we also have similar student groups, and I myself am a university student as well. And here, the student groups are called the Ahlul-Bayt Islamic Society, also known as ABSOC, And the umbrella organization for them is called the Muslim Student Council, also known as MSC. There's around 30 societies across the UK, and it's very nice to see that similar groups around the world, for example, in America, such as yourself, are taking initiative to try to bring the community together during these unprecedented times. So this is very nice. I'm very happy to be part of this. Inshallah, I can do a good job. So as I mentioned, the topic today is student social justice activism. And before I tell about how the session would be running, I'm just going to mention a little bit about why the session is important. So many of us in university might have reflected about social justice and activism. Many of us may be coming from ethnic minorities ourselves. And if we haven't experienced some sort of injustice ourselves, we might have known family members or friends or people close to us who have. So it might be a bit of a personal thing in that way. And also our faith talks about social justice as well and activism. So I've got two examples here. So an ayah from the Quran. In chapter 4, Surah Nisa, ayah 135, it says, "O you who believe, stand up firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even though it be against yourselves or your parents or your kin, be rich or poor. Allah is better protector to both than you. So follow not the lusts of your hearts, lest you may avoid justice." And we also know numerous hadith by the Prophet ﷺ, who also talks about standing up for justice. One such example is the Prophet ﷺ has said, whosoever sees an evil, let him change it with his hand. And if not able to do so, then let him change it with his tongue. And if not able to do so, let him hate it in his heart. And that, the latter, is the weakest of faith. So it's clearly very important to talk about justice and activism. Therefore, we have three beautiful panelists here, all who have a very diverse background in activism. And so we will be learning from them and finding out from them what their journey was and why they think it's important. So the way the session will go is that I will introduce each panelist and they will speak for between 5 to 7 minutes, 10 minutes maximum, inshallah. And then we will have a question and answer session and points that are worth discussing, we'll talk about it. The viewers can send their questions on the chat section or the comment section on YouTube Live. And inshallah, I'll receive it and I could ask the panelists the questions from your behalf, inshallah. So without further ado, I'm going to, and the session would run hopefully no longer than 55 minutes. So the first panelist I'd like to introduce is Saha Jamshed. Saha has received her undergraduate degree from UC Davis in psychology and a minor in comparative religion. Later, she earned her master's degree in social work from University of Southern California. She worked at John George Psychiatric Hospital, where she completed her clinical hours and gained a variety of experiences working in the ER setting. Simultaneously, Saha has been working at NISA, which is the North American Islamic Shelter for the Abused, which is a Muslim domestic violence organization, and she's been working there for over 15 years, where she provides counseling and case management for survivors of domestic violence and abuse. In addition to NISA, Saha is currently a therapist at the Khalil Center, where she provides premarital, couple, family, and individual therapy. So without further ado, here's Saha.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I'm not sure if you guys how well known NISA is. So NISA is a domestic violence organization. It's actually the only one in the Bay Area, and it started in 2002. And basically, I started working at NISA in 2006. And from what I'm told, some community members who were activists recognized the need for a Muslim domestic violence organization, because community members were constantly reaching out to them for help, right? And then after a while, it was recognized that there needs to be an organization that could provide these victims support. And that's when initially when the organization started, There was a helpline, and most of the services, or all the services, were through referral, right? Referring callers to shelters and other organizations that would be able to provide services. In 2009, NASA purchased a property for the shelter, and that's a home that we can take up to 10 clients at any given time. And I would say, the shelter's occupied most of the time. We hardly ever have space open. And alhamdulillah, we know with the community support in 2020, we actually opened a transitional home, which would be, so in the shelter, clients usually, it's an emergency shelter, the location's confidential, so clients are able to stay in the shelter for up to 3 months. It's supposed to be 3 months, but especially before we started the transitional home, majority of the clients would stay much longer because the population that we serve, it's very difficult for them to adjust to more mainstream shelters. So oftentimes clients receive extensions and stay in the shelter maybe 5, 6, 7 months. So significantly more than the desired time of 3 months. And alhamdulillah, now that we have the transitional home, the clients are able to stay in the transitional home up to 9 months. So ideally, they come to the shelter, the immediate, crisis management, the immediate legal support and all of that is provided. And once things are a little bit more manageable, then they transition to the transitional home, where they have more time to work on career development, become more self-sufficient, and financially independent, so that they can move into their own independent living situations. And that's pretty much it about the work that NISA does.
Definitely under 10 minutes. So thank you. Inshallah, we'll ask you more questions about NISA throughout the program, inshallah. So the next the next panelist I would like to introduce is Huda Khatibi. Huda Khatibi is an Iranian-American writer, community organizer, and creative educator. Her political fashion work has been hailed from the BBC to the New York Times to the pages of Vogue, and featured and cited in books, journals, and museums around the world. Huda is the host of an organization called Because We've Read, which is a radical digital book club and discussion series with over 20 chapters globally. She is also the founding member of Blue Tin Production, an all-women immigrant and refugee-run apparel manufacturing workers and refugee-run apparel manufacturing workers cooperative. And she is a national organizer with Believers Bailout, which is a community effort using zakat to bail Muslims out from pre-trial and immigration incarceration. Her writing has appeared in Newsweek, Washington Post, the Columbia Journalism Review, among others, and frequently gives talks and trainings on stages around the world. Huda runs on Saffron Ice Cream and Colonizer Tears. Without further ado, here's Huda.
Salam. Thank you so much for having me.
Huda, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited and grateful to be here, especially I think in light of just recent incidents that has been happening in our community. I think that it's just really special to be able to be in a space like this one. So thank you for having this space and for organizing it. Apologies for my dead jasmine tree behind me. I'm trying my best. Just not figuring out its watering schedule. So just ignore it, pretend that it's thriving and I'm great at plants. But yeah, I'm excited to be here and also sort of bring some of the work that we've been doing with Believers Bailout, which is a national bail fund that we use zakat funds in order to bail Muslims out of pretrial incarceration and immigration detention. And something that I think, obviously I think incarceration is just a major issue in the United States as well as in the UK. But I think especially in a time of COVID, we're in a sort of a crisis. Being incarcerated in a global pandemic, when these systems are not made to care for us, is a death sentence. And so it's particularly urgent right now that we think about the people who also do not have access to be able to get not only medical supplies, but just the ability to go see like adequate medical care, and or even socially distant. So something that I do want to just ground our sort of conversation is that a lot of people right now, when we think about COVID and the global pandemic, is that people say that COVID is sort of this like great equalizer. But I really want to push back against that, because COVID is not just, we're not all at the same risk of getting the virus. In fact, it plays off of already pre-existing structural inequalities within our society and exacerbates those. And so this virus really teaches us something that I think Islam has sort of taught us for a long time, but that's we're only as safe as our most vulnerable person in our society, and we're only as protected as our least protected person in society. And so I think COVID has really made that very clear for us, that even if one person is at risk in our society, then we literally are all at risk. And I think that that's just really, really important on a very basic and fundamental level, that our health and our lives are deeply connected on a global scale. And I think that it's very indicative when we look around us in the United States, for example, that the structures that we find ourselves in are not made to care for us. And the world that we found ourselves in, particularly in the United States, we're seeing that time after time, the system is failing us. And that's the reason why everything's sort of falling apart. Because if this was, if this was a system that was caring for us, we would have a shortage of bombs, not of healthcare equipment, we wouldn't have a shortage of guns. We would have a shortage of guns. We wouldn't have a shortage of face masks. So I think just thinking about the situation that we find ourselves in and what we have a surplus of and what we have just a deep lack of, I think it's indicative of a deeper system that has been constantly sort of exacerbating inequalities at a structural level. So I think COVID has really illuminated a lot of those. And so the crisis that we're dealing right now with people who are currently incarcerated is not new. The crisis of mass incarceration in the United States has existed long before COVID, and it's up to us in this moment to make sure that it does not exist after COVID. And I think to be able to understand what the particular sort of the urgency around releasing people or demanding mass release in this moment right now is to really be able to first understand what the prison system looks like in the United States, like why the prison system itself is such a deep and devastating issue within the United States. And I think that one thing that's really beautiful that we are trying to sort of develop at Believers Bailout is an Islamic language and Islamic framework for being able to understand mass incarceration and really be able to break it apart. So for example, like in the United States, mass incarceration is really rooted in a global or larger system that is focused on control of bodies, that's heavily racialized, and also just really rooted in terms of like a racialized control of bodies that we've seen comes out of just very, very violent histories of control in the United States, especially when it comes to race and class. So we know that Black Americans are disproportionately represented in jails. We know that working class communities are disproportionately represented in jails. And we also know that Muslims are disproportionately represented in jails. And that this is a sort of a deeper structural issue that has been really affecting our communities for such a long time. And so I think that's something else that's really important to understand is how antithetical the modern prison system is, or prisons in the United States is, to our understandings of justice as Muslims. This is a system that's rooted in punitive justice, whereas Islam, what do we say every time we start anything? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of the most merciful and compassionate. So how can we sit and talk about mercy and really have our whole faith be really framed by mercy and compassion, and not be able to actually actualize that when we think about justice, or when we think about who isn't receiving that justice in the United States? So, I could talk for hours and hours about the corruption of our prison system, but just to quickly sort of rein it in, I think what's really important is that this work is not new that we're doing. And we can understand the modern prison system in the United States by understanding also a history of Muslims, particularly Black Muslims in the United States, and the ways in which they've been able to really resist state violence has shaped the modern prison system. And so I think a history of Muslims in this country is very much linked to a history of mass incarceration. And so it's not even something that, like, I think as non-Black Muslims, we should be thinking about as like allyship, but something that is so deeply integral to our own Muslim history in the United States. And just to give like a bit of quick numbers, there are over 2 million people currently incarcerated in the United States. Like, that's a massive number of people, and 500,000 people are just incarcerated for pretrial incarceration, which means that they haven't actually been convicted of anything. They're literally just sitting in jail because they don't have enough money to pay their ransom. Pretrial incarceration or bond is basically a ransom to the state. It's money bail, it's unjust, it's classist, and it's racist. So at Believers Bailout, what we do is that we bail people out using zakat, because part of a way that we can use zakat is actually to free our people from bondage. And so using that Islamic principle, we pay for people's bail to be able to bail them out of incarceration so they can be reunited with their families, so they can spend Ramadan at home. And we see just time after time how much that people who are on bail and who are not able to go home just because they can't afford their bail completely destroys lives. It has ripped families apart, and it's been ripping families apart since far before Trump and far before camps at the border. So I think that what we really need to understand, I think, is how we can, as Muslims also, and what we're really trying to envision at Believers Bailout, is how we can imagine and envision a world in which justice is not punitive, but is actually rooted in an ethos of the Prophet and the Ahlul-Bayt and the ways in which they've showed us what justice and rahmah really looks like. And so I think there's so much beauty in our tradition for being able to illuminate what a really just system could look like without putting people in cages, without viewing bodies as disposable. And so I think there's so much that we can sort of uncover and really explore to think about what abolition looks like in this moment, what mass release looks like, but also what true justice looks like for our people and beyond.
Thank you very much, Huda. That was very, very quick, bite-sized, and informative. Inshallah, I'm sure everyone has many questions to ask about what you just spoke. So next panelist that would be talking right now would be Zainab Husseini. Zainab Husseini is a PhD candidate in developmental and psychological sciences at Stanford University. She is the Social Justice Director for Stanford Muslim Student Union. Her research employs social justice frameworks to build programs that address the psychosocial health of children impacted by traumatic events, specifically refugees. She seeks to bridge the developmental gaps that many refugee children experience through scholarship and activism, working with refugee communities in Mexico, Greece, Lebanon, and Iran. She also practices as a mental health clinician in San Jose, California, and is part of the Refugee Health Alliance, an organization providing medical and mental health services to asylum-seeking migrants in Tijuana, Mexico. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So here is Zainab.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm also excited to be engaging in this conversation. I would like to ask everybody to recite a Fatiha for all of the, just like as Huda mentioned, all of the recent killings that have been happening that have been specifically targeting Shias. And I would like to ask everyone to recite a Fatiha while you're watching this for those victims, and pray for their families, inshallah. So as Mariam mentioned, a lot of my work is situated around the experiences of migrants and refugees, and what that looks like in different parts of the world. So first, to start at a macro level and just kind of give a big picture of what it looks like, we have about, as of today in the world, per numbers at the UNHCR, which is the UN agency for the refugees, per their numbers, we have about 29.5 million refugees worldwide who are registered as refugees. And then there are another over 40 million people who are internally displaced. This means that they haven't moved from their country to outside of their country. They've just been internally displaced from a part of their country to another part of their country. But again, they're populations who are forcibly displaced from where they called home. And then there are another about 3.5 million people who are asylum seeking. So these are people who have already left their countries, but are at another port of entry or in another country, but they still have not been granted this refugee status. My work is situated in different refugee contexts in parts of Europe and in the Middle East, but most recently the work that I have been doing, especially during COVID, has been in Tijuana with the asylum seeking refugees at the ports of entry around the US. So we know that because of a lot of the structural issues that exist and happen, and I think it's incredibly important to recognize the role of imperialism and how a lot of imperialist countries have brought about these atrocities that lead to folks having to leave those countries and get to these ports of entry where they're trying to now enter those countries. We have to recognize the impact and role of that, but we know that as a result of what happens in all of those structural issues, the refugees face an incredibly high levels of trauma. So there's an enormous amount of traumatic adversity that these populations are faced with, and these are generations after generations after generations who often experience this. And there's a term there's a term for it. There's intergenerational trauma across many of these populations. So right now, if I wanted to talk about refugees, we would have to break it down in terms of region and what those idiosyncrasies look like. But I want to talk a little bit specifically because we are so close to the ports of entry around the US. I want to kind of just situate this conversation around their experiences, so we can always talk about other refugee populations as well. So specifically in Tijuana, where the border with San Diego at the south of California is located, I actually just tried to get a recent headcount from one of the physicians who's on the ground who we work with. And she said, we don't know because of the chaotic situation that has now come about, which I'll explain in just a second. It's very hard to actually pinpoint a number and know how many folks are trying to seek asylum at those ports of entry, specifically in Tijuana. What we do know is that once these folks arrive in Tijuana, so once they're at the doorsteps of the US, they've faced incredible levels of trauma. So they're already fleeing very high adversity situations. After leaving those high adverse situations, across their journey, they face more incredible levels of trauma. Some of them include things like risks of human trafficking, having your belongings, very limited belongings, be stolen, physical injury. I mean, there's a lot and just loads of adversities that folks are exposed to as they just try to relocate from one place to another. So I really want to drive this home, because when you think about moving from one place to the other, you think about going to the airport, and my biggest issue as a hijabi is that the TSA is going to bother me, which is a big problem. But I'm just like putting that out there, but that's the biggest concern that I may have. I may be concerned about a flight getting delayed, but we can't imagine the levels of adversities that these folks have to go through just to migrate, just to get from point A to point B and get to that port of entry. So after all of that, after they've already arrived at that border and are about to seek asylum and are about to present their case, there's an abundance of other types of trauma that they may be exposed to just while waiting to enter the country. So there's a risk of disappearance, a very high risk of disappearance, in fact, for the folks who are waiting at the border because they're being persecuted by gangs and other violent groups that they're escaping from, which I just want to make a point that those gangs are also a byproduct of a lot of US policies, just again, putting it out there. Anyway, so the point is that these are folks who have high levels of complex trauma. There is like trauma after trauma after trauma that just builds up. And these are the folks who are trying to seek asylum into the US. Now, come the situation and come the context of COVID, similar to what Huda said, it's incredibly important to recognize that how we're experiencing the current pandemic and COVID-19 is worlds different than how a lot of other marginalized populations are experiencing this. So you have folks who are in shelters, I know of a shelter that hosts about 800 people within two warehouses. This is at the top of a mountain where the ground is literally crumbling beneath their feet because they're at the top of a mountain, like on the edge somewhere. You can imagine what social distancing in 6 feet apart, standing 6 feet apart, looks like in that space. They very recently, the Refugee Health Alliance, which is the organization I work with, very recently situated washing stations for them because washing hands became so important. So just like the process of the virus spread and all of that in and itself has a whole lot of nuances that we need to think about as it comes to the experiences of these folks with the virus. There's also, when you and I think about the uncertainties that are happening right now with not knowing what's going to happen with your classes next quarter, or not knowing when you can go to your favorite restaurant again, or making travel plans. That uncertainty is difficult for us, just psychologically. For us as humans, it makes us feel unpredictability in general doesn't do well with humans. That's exponentially exacerbated for that population, because they're a population who has gone through hell to get to that border. They already have this sense of uncertainty because they have no clue if they're going to be able to get to physical safety or not. And now there's this added layer of, like COVID-19 happened. Asylum applications are not being accepted anymore. Now there's utter chaos because folks don't know where they're going to be able to be admitted. They can't leave the shelters because the shelters have closed their doors to prevent spread inside of the shelters, so prevent COVID from going in the shelters and also leaving the shelters. So I just want to point out the fact that the way they're experiencing this current pandemic is, it's just incredibly important to look at how they're experiencing the current pandemic from their specific lens, and recognizing all the different ways that they're at risk and vulnerable to experiencing the pandemic in a lot more difficult ways. I'll just stop at that right now.
Thank you very much, Zainab. That was very, very thought-provoking. So thank you to all the panelists for the quick spiel that they just told us. Lots of questions I'm sure have been brought up. So just to our viewers, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat section of the YouTube Live, and then the organizers would send that to me and I could ask the panelists. So I'm just going to open the floor by saying, could each of you just give us a quick run through of how you ended up working in this field? I know some of you have touched upon it, but one day you weren't involved in this sort of activism and the next day you are, and you're talking about it now here. So can you please just tell us about how that happened, especially since I'm sure you've had other options as well that maybe were more glamorous. So what made you choose this path in life? So we'll start with Saha Jamshed, if she's ready.
Okay. Yeah, so I would say for me, from like very early on, I knew that I wanted to work with in a field where I'd be supporting women specifically, and also working with Muslims. I think growing up, I witnessed, many women who were in abusive situations, sometimes maybe even if it wasn't severely physical, emotional, psychological abuse, and they really didn't have much of an option as far as seeking support within the community. And being around that and being somewhat exposed to that. I mean, alhamdulillah, not in my own family, but in the community. It was very clear, and I think, it was a passion for me to be able to work with a organization that would actually provide support to those women and community members.
Thank you very much. Inshallah, later I will ask some questions about the challenges you faced and also the sort of taboos within the community about domestic violence, because I'm sure it's a huge topic. But just to get the other panelists to also share their journeys, if Hodan's ready, could you please tell us as well?
Yeah, of course. I think it's maybe a little bit more of a complicated answer, but I'll try to just give like an overview. I think so. I was actually born and raised in Oklahoma, which was just like a horribly racist experience, being visibly Muslim. And I think so from a very young age, I was forced to be politicized in ways that I didn't even choose to be. I was just called everything under the sun just by wearing a hijab. And so I think I started becoming very interested in sort of just different political issues by virtue of them being forced on me. And so I think like as I came to Chicago in 2012 and started to really get more involved in different things that felt very important to me, I think that logically, I think when we realize also like how interconnected all of our struggles really are, I think that it makes sense when we think about sort of what like I'm facing as like a Muslim in this like in the United States, and how that is like deeply related to the war on terror, which is related to mass incarceration, which is related to surveillance. And so I think that for me, I think it's maybe it might be, but I think it's kind of beautiful in a way that like it's so tangible how deeply interconnected all of our struggles are. And so I think just by virtue of I think just being like active in different spaces, I think because I believe Prevalent is one of many different organizations that I think I'm involved in that all have very interrelated issues that make sense given especially just like how devastating mass incarceration is in the United States, and how I think it's also starting to become exported to different countries as well. So I think that we're kind of in the belly of the beast, if you will, for many things. And I think that it's one of many interconnected issues that I think all of us should be just actively thinking about.
Thank you very much for that as well. So next, Zainab, could you please tell us about your journey?
Yeah, I think there are definitely two dimensions to this. There's like a personal dimension that has to do with my family history, and another part that has to do with my own journey academically and in doing research and getting interested in this part and that part. But I think the personal part may just be more interesting of a story to tell. My mom is a convert to Islam, and one of the reasons that really inspired her to come to Islam was the social justice lens that Islam has in relation to helping the needy, etc. She comes from a Franciscan tradition before converting to Islam. Shout out to my mom if she's watching this. So I think that just that spirit was very much present in my upbringing because of that journey that she experienced. So that always just gave me a critical lens for looking at the experiences of folks who were marginalized and who were more vulnerable. And I think because of that lens, as I had different academic experiences or, I don't know, jobs, et cetera, it gave me an inclination to be interested in just being mindful of those who are around you and what they have and what they don't have and the privileges that you hold and how to interact with that.
Thank you very much for that, Zainab. So just the next question would be, so you're all Muslim women. Have you found Islam to be helpful in this work? And if you have, what's the inspiration that Islam kind of gives you to continue with this work? Especially because a lot of you perhaps are doing work that's not, I guess, typical in the Muslim community, or like Saha said, might come with a lot of taboos and judgments. So please tell us about how Islam has helped you navigate through this, starting with Saha if she's ready.
Yeah, so I would say as far as Islam goes, I think, early on, I was not, brought up in a like practicing family. As I was in high school and started college, I learned more about Islam. And I think what really attracted me about Islam was the role of women and the way that it liberated women. And I mean, generally, Islam, I do believe that Islam, stands or asks Muslims and everyone to stand against oppression and promote social justice. And I think, again, that's clearly domestic abuse, any type of form of domestic violence goes against that. And so that's what really draws me and also encourages me towards Islam.
Thank you very much. Next, Huda.
Yeah, I think, I think all of we're a faith-rooted organization. So I think all of our work is really rooted in both ideas of Islamic understandings of community, so how zakat can be used, but also ideas of like justice. And I think that that's something that, like I mentioned, I think is just so beautiful and has so much space right now for us to be thinking about how like Islam has like a blueprint of what a society could look like. And so it's like a perfect idea of how we can actually understand true justice. And I think that it's the recognition that we probably won't be able to achieve pure justice on this earth, and there is an afterlife to be able to like achieve that, but that means still that we have to do what we can to get as close as possible. And I think that it's really difficult sometimes to sit and be able to think about what a world could look like without prisons, because we've just so much internalized not only cages as justice, but of bombing countries as democracy, as mass surveillance or border checks as like national security. So I think we're in this country, we've sort of so much, and just around the world, normalized systems and structures of control and violence that we never really get the chance to imagine and sit like what a world would actually look like that we can all not just like survive but thrive in. So I think what's really beautiful about Islam is that it gives us that blueprint to think about these questions in a way that allows us to be grounded in something that's bigger than ourselves. And so I think that it's a great place to be able to start thinking about, well, what does justice look like? Like, what is the role of mercy in terms of justice, and how is it not actually being applied in our justice system right now? And so I think that it allows us to really think about things in ways that we haven't really been able to, or feel very much constricted. And it's so opening and so encouraging and inspiring to be able to look at just the legacies of the Prophet and his family that they've lived, and be able to model for us like what that world could look like, and what a level of perfection could look like that we can just aspire to get closer to. So I think absolutely it's so important that Islam is the root of so much of our work, because that's where we're sort of grounded in and are focused in, but also our sort of our focus point of where we're dreaming from as well.
Thank you very much. Zainab, could you as well?
Yeah, I really love this idea that Hoda, you mentioned about the blueprint. I think just the idea that we have a blueprint, guys. Like, there is a blueprint out there where we know how justice is to be implemented. We have examples of folks who have given us ample ideas and evidence for how that is to be done. And it's a matter of us interpreting that, implementing that, organizing around that, all of that. So I just want to echo that idea of a blueprint. Another thing that just comes to my mind are a number of ayahs in the Quran that are especially inspiring for me. One of the ayahs it's in Surah Al-Insan. It revolves around the experience of the Ahlul-Bayt giving of their food after 3 days of fasting. And I'm sure most people are aware of this story, where they like just give a lot of themselves at the cost of their own eating or the food that they like. And I think it was really interesting, because I think one of the tafsir for those ayahs was that this was actually whatever the food was. This was that specific tafsir I was reading, but whatever the food was that they were going to make iftar was actually a food that they liked. The Ahlul Bayt who shared it, they liked eating that food, but nonetheless they shared it. So I thought that's just really inspiring for me. And then there are other ayahs in Surah Al-Baqarah around, I think it's ayah 272, that revolves around the concept of infaq, and again, giving and sharing of yourself, and a lot of the parameters around that. I think that's another area that's inspiring for me, and I think just really guides in feeling really solid that this is something that is rooted in an Islamic way of life, in an Islamic identity, and like we're good going with this angle.
Thank you very much. So next, I'm just going to ask some questions about the individual work that you do, especially the challenges, because we know that this work isn't easy. So starting with Saha, you alluded that working with domestic abuse is a taboo subject and something that's not really addressed in the Muslim community. Can you please talk a little bit more about that, and also how you suggest we go about fixing that issue within our communities?
Can you guys hear me? Okay. So I would say one of the most important, significant ways that Nisa addresses that within the community is that we do have religious leaders involved at Nisa. The president of Nisa is actually an imam. Imam Tahir, which through my own work, sort of on the front line with the clients, with the families who are experiencing abuse, this is critical, right? Because a lot of times, very often, individuals who call the helpline to seek support, they're very reluctant to take steps and maybe, separate from the abuser because of the misconceptions and maybe misunderstandings about Islam and how it encourages women to be patient and endure a certain level of abuse, right? So oftentimes when callers are informed that, yes, we're a Muslim organization, we have community members, religious leaders who are actually a part of the organization, it gives them a lot of confidence in taking these steps, right? So I'm not necessarily stepping outside of boundaries of Islam when I'm seeking support, but rather this is what's encouraged Islamically and also within by practicing Muslims, right? So oftentimes when I talk to callers who communicate this doubt and maybe self-blame and reluctance, and we talk about it and how, even like Imam Tahir, for example, being involved and what the Islamic perspective is on domestic violence, it gives them a level of confidence to take the necessary steps. And I also, I think I missed the portion of actually communicating and maybe sharing some of the challenges that our clients face because of COVID-19. For some reason, I thought initially we were going to just give an overview and then go into that. So I don't know if you guys want me to go briefly into that quick if we have time, or maybe leave it later. Yeah, because I don't want to leave that portion of information. So generally, I think as far as our clients go, victims or survivors who have left the abuser face because of COVID-19, one major part of it is just being stuck at home, right? I mean, as far as the victims go, before they leave the abuser, they're usually confined to the home anyway. A lot of times abusers do isolate the victims in the house. They're not allowed to go out. They're not allowed to, oftentimes, even when the abuser goes to work, for example, he locks the door, takes the key with him, and she's not able to leave. But I think what the challenge right now for the victims is that he's also home with her, right? So the incidents, the triggers are more common, more frequent, more intense. And then another challenge is that a lot of the services that are available have been paused, right? So shelters have paused their intake, transitional homes. Like we have clients who are in our shelter who are wanting to transfer to other transitional homes, and we're not able to because they're not processing intakes, and therefore our current clients are staying in our shelter longer. Again, prevents those callers who are needing space, who are in emergency situations, from coming to the shelter, right? So limits the amount of services that are available. And another challenge is that the victims, since the abuser is always home, they're not able to leave, right? So even the ones that we had been in contact with prior to the shelter in place, who we were working on a safety plan and safety exit, they're not able to leave because he or she, whoever the abuser is, they're home all the time. And one major concern for me, because of the shelter in place, is the children who are experiencing the abuse, right? So they're not going to school, they're at home in that negative abusive environment. Even if the abuse is not directed toward the children, they're in the environment all the time, right? And more as far as the frequency and the duration of that exposure is definitely increased. And then the mental health services, I do have clients who were in therapy and have paused because, we would have a session when the abuser was at work and outside of the home. And now because they're home all the time, we have to pause the sessions, which again, they don't have that emotional support that they need. And then lastly, I think just generally, as far as the COVID-19 goes, the services being paused, courts are closed, right? We have clients who are needing to file restraining orders, but that's really slowed down. I have a client who, you know, who her 5-year-old son was being abused by the father, and you know they're in the process of figuring out the custody, and they had a court coming up, and that's been paused, right? So even though Child Protective Services have been notified and steps have been taken, the child still has visitation with the father, even though, like in my opinion, it's a really unsafe environment to be in, right? So again, we're waiting for these steps to be taken, for it to be processed, for him to not for the visitations to end, right? So these are, I think, major ways that factors that have kind of been impacted because of COVID-19. And then as far as, yeah, I think I answered all of it. Yeah, sorry.
Only because we're behind schedule. So we've got quite a few questions from the audience as well. So if I could just ask Zainab and Huda, in addition to quickly answering the challenges that you're facing, could you also touch on how organizations such as APSA can practice social justice? And then we'll come back to you, Sahan. You could give your comment on that as well. So next, I guess, Huda.
Yeah, so really quickly, I guess challenges, the state, obviously, big challenge there. But I think within like the Muslim community, I think that unfortunately, like criminality has been very racialized, and also that a lot of Muslims have also really just internalized just an understanding of punitive punishment and an understanding that there are bad people and not people who just do bad things. And so I think that there's like a deep rupture in our community between like I think what we're sort of reading in the Quran and then how we're practicing our faith and how we're holding each other accountable in a way that is just. And frankly, anti-Blackness is like a huge issue in the community that makes a lot of work around decarceration and abolition really difficult and challenging within non-Black communities. But I think in terms of like how we can, like how students can get, yeah, okay, how students can get involved in social justice, right. I think like everything. As a student, you have so much power because your university is probably invested in prisons. Your university is probably invested in apartheid Israel and companies that profit from that. And those companies are actually very much shared. There's a lot of companies that are, like I mentioned, this sort of global interconnectedness of all of these things. A lot of the same surveillance companies are shared between Israel and India and the United States. And your university is probably invested in it. So thinking about what your power is as a student and being able to map out how to be able to actually leverage that in a way that can actually push for really amazing radical change. I think beyond that is understanding that a lot of universities also act as gentrifying forces. So what communities were there before your university sort of pushed people out, and how are you building with the actual community outside of the campus? And I think that there's a lot of questions that students should be asking themselves. For the sake of time, I won't ask all of them, but I think that there's a lot of space to be able to really learn and grow and be really intentional about how you're organizing and knowing your power and value as a student and how you're really being able to activate that to push your university to have really drastic change and within the community as well.
Thank you very much. So Zainab? You're muted.
Can you just repeat that your question one more time? The first question, it was about challenges?
So the first question was about the challenges you face in your work, but try to answer as quickly as possible.
Okay. I mean, I think that, I guess one of the biggest challenges for me personally is that there are just so many levels of harm that is done at a structural level to refugees all across the world. It's just, I always find it hard to scaffold where I want to get involved. And I mean, that part is especially challenging for me. I won't go too in depth into it because of time, but I think just leaving it at that I think because there's just structural levels, institutional levels that are pushing these refugees, and then that kind of goes into the very interpersonal challenges that they also face. And I think that sometimes getting access to the spaces where the refugees are also present can be partially challenging as well, just because they're kind of like pushed to the side into camps. That's especially the case in Greece, where the refugees are primarily in these camp settings. And the other question was about what organizations like APSA or students can do. I think I'm going to talk about it mostly at what students can do. I think it's always been helpful for me to think about what can be done at two levels. One part is the macro level, so being very mindful and aware of the very ways that your university is imposing a lot of these injustices in the communities that are around them. So just being aware of it, organizing it around it. There's always student organizations that are organizing around some injustice that is happening around you. So I never want to hear anybody saying, oh, I don't know, like what to get involved with. Your work and figure out like which part you're passionate about and just get involved. And I think the other part is a very like personal thing. You're able-bodied, that's already like, you've been blessed with an able body that can like get up and go do something. So it's also possible for you to use your presence, your volunteer services, whatever it is that you're good at, in spaces. So for instance, I know that like at Stanford, there are volunteer opportunities where the law school takes folks down to the border to do legal work, and they don't have to be law students. So they just get a quick training, and then they help folks translate sometimes. Sometimes they help them just fill out these asylum applications, etc. And then the last thing that I really quickly want to say is scholarship. So especially as grad students, there's an enormous amount of power in writing and just putting your thoughts out there, and through your scholarship, you have the opportunity to do that. I'm speaking, I mean, that this is even for the engineers and all the people in STEM out there, because that's very popular right now. It's possible for you to use your scholarship, even if you're in those fields, to address some of the needs in the communities.
Thank you very much. And Saha, if you can also answer the question of how students can get involved in your organization.
I would say, as far as being involved in our organization, they can donate, they can volunteer, but I would say more important than anything is talking about domestic violence. I think oftentimes within the Muslim community, it's seen as a private issue. And I think the more we talk about it and the more communities are educated, the more likely that when the awareness increases, more victims will seek support and get the help that they need.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to ask one last question, a different one from each of the panelists, so we get a variety of questions sort of ticked. So Hoda, one of the viewers has asked, how does one envision a different system which does not replicate the injustices that are so prevalent? If you can please quickly share your thoughts on that.
I don't know if I could quickly answer that question. She's like, okay, imagine in an alternative world in 5 seconds. I mean, this is a really, really amazing question, and also really difficult to answer in a short amount of time. But I think that it ultimately, like, it really does start like on a local level of really just imagining and understanding like what justice actually looks like and what it doesn't look like. And so we're an abolitionist organization, which means that we are not asking for a reform of the prison system. We're asking for the removal of the prison system, but also with it, the conditions that create the capacity for or create the environment in which prisons are seen as necessary. And so I think that, like I mentioned earlier, like I think that we've normalized just so many things that just aren't normal. The fact that the president of the United States can tweet people to like ingest Clorox or, whatever nonsense in order to fight, we've normalized a level of like insanity and also violence. And I think that if we're able to really from like on a personal level, like something that's been helpful for me is to actually just really sit and read the Quran and read like just spiritual text from a place of reading it like your politics and not just like a religious text that's like separate from your politics. I think that's been really helpful for me, just to be able to actually think through, if the Prophet, peace be upon him, was alive today, would he be paying taxes? Honestly, like in my honest opinion, I really think that if the Prophet was alive today in the United States, he would be incarcerated. And so what does that say about all of our people who are incarcerated right now, you know? And so I think that there's so much that if we really just ground ourselves in the values that we have, of transformative justice, of mercy, of compassion, of rahmah, all of these things that we say over and over again. So what does it mean to actually actualize that? And so I think that that is just the beginning, and I, for the sake of time, I'll end it there. But I think it really is just like knowing that we have a really beautiful and rich tradition and history and lineage and culture, and like how can we sort of use that to address contemporary social issues?
Thank you so much. I know it was difficult to answer that question in that period of time, but it was very informative. Thank you. So I'm going to ask Zainab a question. So a lot of students in university may be faced with what I would say maybe more popular initiatives to be active about, maybe like, I don't know, Palestine or other initiatives that a lot of Muslim people have been historically very active in that aren't bad initiatives, but it's just been done quite a lot of times. How would you describe the importance of working towards local initiatives in this scenario?
I just want to say a major like, that's you can't hear me, but I'm saying a lot back here. That's such a good question, because I think there definitely is this tendency to get involved with the more popular, more large scale issues where there may be more resources for where you can get involved with those things that stand out most. Let's first make space for folks who are interested in getting involved in those, as long as it has to do with working towards a more just society, working towards a potential, that blueprint that Huda mentioned. I think that's a first step. That's actually great. So let's not trivialize that. But I think at the same time, it's incredibly important to look internally, to just reflect on your intentions and thoughts around why you're doing what you're doing, what are you getting out of it, and then also recognizing how you can, what's in it, what is it that you're gaining from it, because sometimes these things can end up being self-fulfilling a tiny bit as well. It's super important for all of us to be very mindful of that. And I think after that internal process, then it really becomes, all of us have it in us to find where the most need exists, whatever that is in relation to who we are, our life experiences, what we're good at, etc. And just become mindful of the folks who are around us locally as well. It may not even be necessarily a Muslim cause. It may not have to do with Muslim populations or oppression directed at Muslim populations. But I really do believe that once that internal process and that just like a critical reflection of why you do what you do is done, then it becomes possible to become more in depth and reflective of the communities that are around us and those who may need our help urgently, but like are also next door right here in our backyard and could very tangibly benefit from our presence.
Thank you very much. And so the last question I'm going to ask Saha is that often I think students might feel like they want a quick solution. So for example, the work that you do is addressing a chronic problem and the answer, the solution isn't going to come overnight. How would you advise students who might not be able to fathom potentially like working on a subject for years and years and years and maybe never ever see the final solution because it's such a chronic problem? What advice would you give them to kind of, I guess, inspire them to keep up the good work?
I would say just paying attention to, if they're not able to get involved, then maybe create, social change on a larger level, but just being mindful of their interaction and their environment and the individuals that they come across, and really being mindful of the abuse that may exist within those circles, right? So again, sometimes it's even, the benefit that we can provide to individuals around us and really advocating for victims is just sometimes even somebody reaching out and you're just listening, right? A lot of times, for example, victims, they feel like when they do talk about it, there's a lot of judgment, right? So sometimes even at a smaller level, just being that person who when somebody turns to you, you're just present, right? Emotionally present, connected, and you're listening and you're not judging.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, the panelists, for your amazing comments and ideas and the work that you do. Sorry we couldn't delve deeper into it. I'm sure we could talk hours about each of your specialties here. But inshallah, the viewers have gotten a flavor of different causes out there that they could be working towards, and the importance of working towards, different causes and things that resonate with them. So I'm going to hand over to the APSA network right now. I believe there'll be a dua and then we'll be finished. I think I also have to say, I want to say, please subscribe to APSA network and follow them on all the different social media pages. So thank you very much. And now handing over to APSA.
Okay, thank you very much for this great discussion. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma kul waliyak al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan. صلواتك علي وعلى آبائي في هذه الساعة وفي كل الساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. صلوات اللهم صل